cloud. There we go.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you, Amy. We're so happy to have partnered with you on this project. We're so happy to have all of you on tonight joining us for this webinar. My name is Emma Crone. I'm the Executive Director for New York Pork Producers. We also have our board president, Jen Schwab, on with us tonight. Thank you, Jen. I just wanted to introduce this project a little bit. So this was funded by the Pork Checkoff, which are essentially producer dollars that New York pork producers leverages to serve the producer in some way. So that could be through education, research, or it can be through pork promotion, specifically in the consumer space. So we're really excited to be able to get this project off the ground. Some of you may have come across video one already. We have that posted on our YouTube channel, and videos two and three will be coming later this week. So stay tuned for that. We'll make sure you all get the link directly to that YouTube channel. And so we have Tim Terry with us, who has been another great partner on this project. Tim is the Farm Strategic Planning Specialist for Cornell's Pro Dairy team, and he has been indispensable on this project. So we're really happy to have you with us, Tim, and please take it away.
Thanks, Emma. Oh, good evening, everybody. Uh, Coming to you live from blustery Western New York right now. It's about 18 degrees outside, which is about a 15-degree improvement over last night at this time. So I think it's kind of nice that we can do this in-house, literally. Nobody's having to go out and go to an extension office or a fire hall someplace and brave the cold. So get your hot tea, get your blankets, settle down, settle in, buckle up. If you have questions as we go along, again, put it in the chat or raise your hand and we'll get started. So we're talking about dairy barn conversions or converting old dairy barns, which of course there's many of them around, into other usable livestock situations, and in particular, swine facilities. So Jay Harmon at Iowa State University said it best, and we're talking transition housing. The ultimate goal is to provide a positive environment that promotes the welfare of the sows while providing good animal flow to keep animals and people safe. The ability to observe animals and provide these aspects in an economical manner. Now, when we talk about old buildings, what can we do with the old buildings? Well, of course, we can raise it and has it outlived its useful life? Is it time to just salvage what we can and put it to rest? This is probably the most drastic choice, but also might be an issue of safety. If the barn has not been cared for properly, it could be a ticking time bomb just waiting for the next windstorm or heavy snowfall. Now, if that's the case, there are companies that will buy these, and I don't know what they'll pay for them, but they take these old barns down and then they turn them into coffee tables, bar stools, headboards, you name it. And that might be an option. And this is just one here. I know there are several companies out there. I'm not endorsing any one in particular, just this was an example. Or we can remodel it, which is kind of what we'll be talking about today, upgrade it and be able to use it for a hog operation. We can retrofit it maybe a little bit and update it, upgrade it, and make it more usable for what we want to do. Just remember, if it's about 50%, if it's more than 50% of building a new one, think long and hard about that. Now, granted, that's kind of a guideline, but again, if it's more than 50% of what a new one would cost, maybe you want to look more towards the new. Now, that's not a hard and fast rule, and there is some discretion involved in there. But there are three reasons that support that. And the first one is we tend to overestimate the value of the existing structure. Now, granted, there's almost always the sentimentality factor, and it can be very hard to walk away from, let alone raise the building great grandpa constructed with his own two hands from the raw materials he found on site. However, we really need to see this as sunk capital, just as if it was sitting on the bottom of the ocean. It's gone, it's unrecoverable, and throwing more money after it is not a wise use of resources. And reason number two is we tend to underestimate the cost of remodeling. It's not until we start peeling back the layers that we see the hidden structure or what may be left of it. And we may not be able to install any new systems without compromising the structural integrity of the facility. And then many may feel they can reduce expenditures by doing it themselves, but they fail to consider the disparity in their skill levels between themselves and the guys that do this for a living. Then again, there's the amount of tinkering required to retrofit 21st century technology into a 19th century structure. And if you're from Eastern New York or New England, that can be an 18th century structure you're dealing with. And then there's the availability of the necessary tools and materials. Um, there are some things that are required for some of these new technologies. And if you have to buy a $4,000 piece of equipment just to make all the plumbing connections, and you only have 20 of them to make, it's kind of hard to justify that cost. Whereas professional, yeah, he's doing this job, he's doing six other jobs, and he can easily spread that cost out over several units. And then, of course, there's the time cost. You know, as the farmer, the best use of your time and talent is doing the daily chores, planting, harvesting, etc., not necessarily swinging a hammer or spinning a wrench. And then the third reason, we tend to fail to properly value the cost of the long-term efficiencies that are going to remain in the old facility. There's only so much you can do with some of these older buildings. And you might argue, well, it's only 5 minutes a day, but that's also 35 minutes per week and about 30 hours per year, so almost a full work week, or at least half of one, depending on what you consider a full week. But rarely is it only 5 minutes or only one person. And then what about compromised animal performance that we just can't get the growth out of them we want because there's always somebody has a sniffle or there's one section of the barn that the animals just don't do well in. And as long as we still have that building, you're always going to have that issue. And then what about frustrated staff performance? The poor person who's in there working and just they have hit that low milk line just one time too many, you know, and they'll let you know about it. So those are the three issues there. But the all important question before we do anything is how do you want to manage? And that must be answered before any designing begins. For example, stalls. Do we want free access, non-gated, or do we want large open pens? How about feeding? Are we going to use feed drops? Are we going to trickle feed? Are we going to floor feed? Are we going to use some electronic feeding, especially with the sows as they start to come into their milk? Then watering, is this going to be water tubs, water troughs, trickle feeders? What are we going to do? And waste management, how are we going to move the manure out in and out of the barn and then out to the field? And how about animal movement? Anytime you move animals, that's a good time to take some measurements on them. We call KPIs or key performance indices. Hey, are these pigs growing like we want them to? Are they doubling or tripling their weight, from birth to weaning? Are they, once they move from, a feeder group to finish group, what is their weight gain? Try to figure out, okay, how can we do this safely and quietly without upsetting the animals and get the data that we actually need? Because again, the goal is to efficiently and effectively use what you have available to arrive at a good system at an economical cost. So let's talk about structures. Now, there are two issues affecting choices here. And the first is, what is the existing flooring system or material? Well, it could be earthen, which obviously is not recommended. And that's because pigs like to dig. And that's just a pig being a pig. You can't fault them for being a pig. They just like to dig. And if there's an earthen floor, they're going to be digging everything everywhere and may even upset the foundation that is there. And if this was an old dairy barn, it may have been a run-in shed and they just had heifers or dry cows in there, and there may be 1.5 feet, 2 feet of manure in there, and we're going to have to excavate down to some virgin soil before we can do anything else. Then if it's concrete, that's preferred. But again, this is an old dairy barn, and so it might not be the right profile. You may have gutters in there, you may have mangers, things that you really don't need. And or the concrete could be very slick, especially if they've been scraping it with like a back blade or a skid loader or something else that can really put a polish on that concrete. And that's really the last thing you want when you're moving animals around. And then if it slats over a pit or flush gutter, it sounds desirable, and it is very durable, but the slots may be for heifers and dry cows, not for pigs' feet. And if the slots are too big, pigs can fall down through those slots and break legs and do other damage that's not very good for the whole system. And the other one is the building width. You know, many systems that are available today are modular and the size is fixed. So we got to be able to put these in there either in stacks or rows that actually fit within that structure. And you need room not only for the system, but you need room for the operator, to get in there to take care of waste, to put in bedding, to take out bedding, to go through, add, give them some feed, um, change out that feed if it's building up and not doing well, and get a good eye on those animals each and every day. Now, most dairy barns in the Northeast are somewhere in the range of 36 to 42 feet wide and about 80 to 100 feet long. So that just gives you an idea of what you might be working with. And those things are almost always divided into thirds. You've got 1/3 along each sidewall and a third in the middle. And depending on what's available, depending on what the system we're trying to put in, that can affect how things are laid out. And of course, there's space requirements, and that's going to be dependent upon the number of animals in the pen and their age, because their age is related to their physical size. So we need to determine the space requirements that we're going to need in this barn. Again, like I say, animal weight and size is going to figure in there, as well as group size. Because as we add more animals, you can see that actually the square footage per animal goes down. And that's only because there's a little bit of a fixed cost, so to speak, in terms of space. That minimum space, that fixed cost, is now spread over more animals, so we don't need as much space per animal. And we're always talking net square footage. In other words, the area that the animals are actually going to occupy. So we can't figure in this number here the alleyways, scrape alleys, feed alleys, things where the animals do not normally reside. And then that too, we have to take into considering dynamic versus static grouping. In other words, are we moving animals in and out of this group, or is the same group staying together and then being moved through the system? Because what happens is when you have a dynamic system where you're bringing animals in and out, there's always that pecking order. All has to be rearranged every time you put new animals in. Even taking animals out will cause a shuffling of the pecking order. If we can keep them static, then we don't need as much room because we won't have the new ones trying to get away from older ones or ones that just have it in for them. We have to consider any future welfare codes that may come along, and these usually arise because of consumer demands, and that's where the FARM program started. The consumers were saying, hey, we want a product, but we want to know that the animals producing that product are being cared for properly, and that's where the FARM program came from. Then, of course, we always want to leave room for expansion, either for the next growth spurt or for the next generation, but we always want to leave that expansion. We never want to build ourselves into a corner. And so let's talk ventilation. We always show this whenever we're talking ventilation. This is usually the first slide. And the goal, of course, is to provide fresh air at a velocity and volume that it's going to mix all these things and remove all this nasty stuff and get it out without causing a draft on the animals. Now, we need to ventilate not only for the livestock, but for the barn as well. And we want sufficient air exchange so it's only slightly stale air going out. If you're smelling ammonia or very strong pig smell, we probably aren't getting enough air through that system. Like I said, we're ventilating for two entities, the animals and the facility. And unless it is overcrowded or very small facility, it's very small, the facility demands are usually greater than the animal requirements. Now, animal requirements are usually figured on CFM or cubic feet of air moved per minute. And that varies with winter or with the season as well as the animal size and age. And you can see what the ranges are. And these are all CFM or cubic feet of air per minute being moved either during the winter or during the summer. And these are our target temperatures that we want to reach. This is kind of the comfort area. And sometimes, just because of the size of the animal or type of facility, we have to add a little extra heat. And this is in BTUs per hour that we need to add to that building just to keep it up at this temperature. When we're dealing with small ruminants, usually this is not an issue because there's so much heat generated with those animals. That's not a consideration. But we definitely want to hit that sweet spot, that nice comfort zone. And you can see that comfort zone changes according to body weight. And that comfort zone is based on temperature. Now, if it's less than that, the animals are under cold stress, which means they're going to be burning calories to stay warm instead of to grow and to flourish. And if it's heat stress, it's kind of the same thing happens when we get out there. But what happens here is they're spending some energy to try and cool themselves, so they may be panting or doing other things. But also with the heat stress, just like you and me, when it's hot out, we don't want to eat much. So if they're not taking their groceries in, they're not going to grow. So we want to aim for that comfort zone. Now, the facility, that's measured in air changes per hour. And that's really the number of times per hour the entire interior volume is exchanged. In other words, we're moving everything out and in and new fresh air in every so often. And those numbers for the winter, we're talking 4 to 6 air changes per hour. So about every 10 to 15 minutes, we're completely changing that air in there. And that's to keep the animals healthy. The fall and spring, we have to ramp it up a little bit because it is a little bit warmer. So about every 2 to 3 minutes, we're changing that air. And then in the summer, we're looking about every minute, minute and a half, we're changing everything. So yes, that's going to take quite a bit of fan horsepower to do that. And we want to monitor that interior temperature. And again, aim for that comfort zone. That's where we want to be. That's where the animals are going to be the healthiest. Performance is going to be best. Now, there's a few options in terms of ventilation. We can have natural ventilation, where we rely on Mother Nature to do most of the work. We have negative pressure, where we're trying to draw the stale air out and therefore draw fresh air in. Or we can use a positive pressure system where we're pushing fresh air into the building. And what that might look like when we're talking naturally ventilated air, naturally ventilated barns, excuse me. We have big openings on the eaves or side walls that allow the prevailing winds to force fresh air into the building. And then by natural buoyancy, in other words, warm air rises, cool air falls, we have these ridge open, maybe a ridge opening, it may be a cupola. This air rises through there and goes out. And the fact, as it rises, it creates a void, so now fresh air comes in. Unfortunately, wind is usually a greater factor than buoyancy, especially in the winter. It's not so much a problem in the summer. However, in the summer, you do have temperature inversions where inside this barn, it can be much cooler than it is outside. So the fresh air doesn't want to come in because it's warmer. It can't come in. We've got this heavier, denser, colder air that's kind of like, relatively speaking, is like jello compared to the air that's outside. So when we have these inversions where it's cooler inside than outside, we can have a ventilation problem. And because we're bringing all this air in, this tends to be a cold facility, and which means it's going to be within 5 degrees one way or the other of what's outside. Now I see there's a hand up. Do we or a chat, Emma? What do we have a question?
Yes, yeah. So we have a question from an attendee. How do you, in a dairy barn, keep the pig nozzles from freezing when it's only pigs in the barn?
That's where the supplemental heat comes in. Um, with like I said, with the small ruminants, there's usually enough uh, heat in that barn produced by the animals to keep things above freezing. With pigs, that's not necessarily the case, and so that's why we have to add supplemental heat in order to, keep the animals within that comfort zone, but also keep the barn from freezing.
Yes, yeah, we run into that issue in our own barn, and a lot of it is either supplemental heat or having enough animals in the barn that their body heat keeps things thawed out. And then we have it's not a question but a comment just talking about weights for mature sows and boars. To that participant, I would just say, it depends on breed and management style. Some people feed less just to ensure that their sows and boars aren't getting too big. But still meeting all their nutritional requirements. So it certainly varies, but they can get up to that 1,000 pound mark for sure. That's all for now, Tim.
Yep. And that's why you have those key KPIs so that you can monitor that. You can't measure it if you don't monitor it. So you can't, man, excuse me. Ugh. Going back to my farm economics days, you can't manage it if you don't monitor it. So if you're looking to hit a certain target and you're not weighing them during those KPIs, yeah, you're going to overshoot or undershoot them. So back to the ventilation systems and mechanical systems. We're talking about negative pressure systems here. And it's the fans and these appropriately sized inlets that cause the air exchange. The fans exhaust the air from the barn, and these designed inlets distribute the fresh air. These are specifically sized and specifically placed based on the fans that you're using. But in order for this to work, we have to have tight construction. So that might be an issue in some of these older barns. Now, what that system might look like, if we look at this bar here, this just kind of gives you an idea of what the velocity of the air coming through is. The light blue is kind of 1 meter per second, and the reds and the oranges and yellows are down 0 to 0.25 meters per second. So those are the velocities coming in. And we can see this would be a negatively pressured system. Maybe we have a fan somewhere along this wall here somewhere. Got these designed inlets. The air is coming in at a velocity that it's getting good mixing. As it comes in, it's going to slow down a little bit and mix with the air that's already in there. Scoop up all the nasty stuff that might be in there, the dust, the dander, the moisture, gases, pathogens, whatnot, and then that eventually finds its way out of the barn. Now we're talking positive pressure systems. The fans cause the air exchange because they force air into the barn. And we usually do this through ducts, or the technical term of this would be a diffuser. Just helps to distribute the air uniformly throughout the barn. Now, it does require some outlets, and we usually figure a minimum of 2.5 square feet of outlet per 1,000 CFN of fan capacity. And we need that, otherwise there could be a back pressure on the system, which will significantly decrease the performance. And this is usually best for choice for retrofit in an old building because tight construction is not required. And if you walk into some of these old buildings, there's more than enough holes for the air to get out. So this tends to be a much better choice rather than the negative pressure system.
Tim,
And
we
then
have another
here,
question, sorry,
okay,
about ventilation.
that's all right.
Would you say that the tubing that's used in dairy barns for ventilation would not be sufficient for pigs as well?
It depends on what's already in there and what it was sized for. Again, usually we're trying to ventilate the building more than we're ventilating the animals. So we're getting those, as long as we're providing those 4 to 6 air changes in the winter and those 40 to 60 air changes in the summer, it doesn't matter if it was designed for cattle versus pigs, as long as we're getting that ventilation and we're more than meeting the CFM per head uh, as far as the animals go. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me.
Okay, just
That's it for now.
okay, not a problem. All right, so back to the supplemental heat. Again, part of the reason we have to provide that supplemental heat is that small pigs have a low mass to surface area ratio. In other words, you've got this little tiny furnace with a lot of exposure to it. It's not like a 200 or 300 pound sow where you've got pretty good massive animal in there with an operating digestive system and relatively less skin proportionally. So the supplemental heat is required to maintain growth and development. Just like I said before, we like to have that hit right in that sweet spot in there. Above it or below it, we're thermally stressing those animals and they're not going to grow as well or perform or be as healthy. Now, there's lots of options to consider. And what you want to think about is, of course, the initial and operating costs. What's it going to cost to get it in there? And what's it going to cost to operate it? What's the service life? Is this something that, every 6 months you're going to have to be replacing a bulb in it or replacing the element? How much of an area is that going to cover? It's not a problem for a heat lamp to cover a small brooder area, but when you're talking, a large feeder pen, you're going to need something with a little more power than that. And then safety, especially when we're talking some of these space heaters. When they're burning the propane, the natural products of propane combustion are CO2 and water. Not a big deal. We just have to be able to get rid of it. However, if it becomes fouled or otherwise not performing like it should, then we've got carbon monoxide, and that obviously is a problem. So those something we need to look at. We also need to look at what are the clearances within the building. Some of these things, especially these infrared tubes and whatnot, require a certain amount of space between them and any combustible materials. I mean, this right here in this installation, they've got steel above it, which is great. It can take a lot of that heat and it won't burn. If this was an old dairy barn, you've probably got, floor joists and subflooring up above, along with a whole host of cobwebs and dust and grain dust and all kinds of nasty stuff that if it gets too close to that, it is going to combust. The other thing, especially when we're talking some of these space heaters, is the ease at which pathogens are spread. That, hey, this one group, one end of the barn has the sniffles in the morning, and by night, everybody in the whole barn has the sniffles because that has just taken that air, warmed it up a little bit, and spread it around the whole facility. So that's something you might want to consider. Uh, this, again, it's kind of a busy table. I realize there is a website for it that you could see it a little closer. But some of the things we're going to look at when we compare these, the heat source, whether it's a forced air, a heat lamp, gas-fired brooder, or radiant tube, for example, the fuel source and the fuel usage, how much are we going to go through? You know, what's going to be the heat output for all that fuel we're going to use? What's it going to cost to purchase and to operate? And what's the number of animals that it would probably take care of? We look at kind of the positives versus the negatives. And again, of course, the average lifespan. Yeah, something may cost more initially, but if you can amortize that over 15 to 20 years versus, 6 months or 5 years for the shrouds, what's going to be the better deal for you? And the lighting. There are lots of options here too. You might have some incandescent ones, incandescent bulbs. Yeah, these are probably just leftovers because they don't make them anymore. Fluorescent aren't bad. They're fairly efficient, a lot more than the incandescent. However, they're not cold tolerant. So if this barn is below 40 degrees or so, these fluorescent lights don't turn on very well. And when you're talking CFLs, it's pretty much the same thing. But again, what's the availability of those now? Used to have the old mercury vapor lights, which gave a very bright white light, but they were slow to turn on, and now there are no ballasts being manufactured, the last 17 years or so. So to be able to service these, it's not very likely. But we do have the high pressure sodium, which operates very similarly, but again, it has that pink orange color to it, which gets you a color rendition in the barn a little funny. And again, like the mercury vapor, they tend to be a slow start. Very efficient, but very slow start. Metal halides, they're great. They're bright white. It's almost to a blue-white color. You tend to see these in what they call a high bay application. So this might be more of a dairy freestall or a shop. You might see it that has a 16, 18-foot ceiling on it. If you're in an old dairy barn, you probably have a 7.5, maybe 8 foot if you're lucky, ceiling. So it may not be your best choice here just because of the position. The other position may be some of these bulbs, they have to be base up or base down, or they can't be base horizontal. So you have to look at, all right, how are we going to install these? What's the application here? Are we going to have to turn these upside down or sideways or some other such thing? And if we do that, are the bulbs going to work? Probably the best choice is LED. Now, these come in various colors and various colors by, I mean, the different whites. Some can be very warm white, others can be a very bright, again, almost that bluish white, which is great when you're talking task lighting. They're supposed to have a very long life, although I've changed enough of these in my life, I don't think I've made the 50,000 hours. But they do produce a lot of light without heat or very little heat. But again, you're looking at that little diode that's maybe a quarter inch in diameter. So how bright do we want to look at, do we want in these barns? Well, generally speaking, for the majority of the barn, usually about 20-foot candles is sufficient. You got to remember when they built a lot of these barns, milking was being done by lantern or candlelight. So there's not a lot of light coming there, but allow them to do it. And it's enough to get you back and forth in the barn to see uh, where things are, see what animals are up and moving around. To give you a little better perspective, think of it as a cozy living room. It's bright enough that you can read a magazine, which I say magazine, I'm probably dating myself. Uh, you know, but unless you're sitting right next to the light, you're probably not going to read your favorite James Michener or Janet Oakey novel. However, then there's task lighting, and again, so that's 50-foot candles, and that's more like a well-lit office space. Again, you're going to be able to see detail, especially things like markings on a syringe body, so that you know you're giving the right dose for that size animal. And you'll be able to see uh, abnormalities on animals, or at least be able to diagnose or pick out animals that are not doing well. And we move on to waste handling. Well, of course, that's going to depend on the form and the bedding used. It might be more or less liquid, it might be semi-solid, it might be solid. Again, how do you want to manage? The existing gutter and barn cleaner in some of these barns may work. but if the drive unit has been sticking out the side of the barn exposed to the weather for a couple decades, probably not, and you may or may not be able to get parts for it. But really, mechanical cleaning is imperative. Be able to plan for that, whether it be something, fork and wheelbarrow gets old really fast. So some things you might want to think about is, hey, can we get a skid loader in there and be able to clean things out? Or maybe some of these little bit smaller compact bucket tractors. Um, they can't handle a lot at one time, but it's a whole lot better than breaking your back and getting blisters on your hands forking the stuff out. Then we have to figure on drainage for washing because we're going to want to wash between groups. And when I say wash, one thing we don't want to do is power wash because all that does is weaponize all the bacteria and dirt and whatnot in the barn. When you hit that with a 2,500 to 3,000 psi wand, yeah, that's going to move a lot of manure off the walls and whatnot, but where is that going to go? And a lot of it gets volatilized, and if there are animals still in another portion of that building, they're going to be breathing it in. So unless you're doing all in, all out on a particular building, don't figure on power washing. Steam washing is a little bit better, but still the pressure there can volatilize a lot of that stuff. You're better off with a garden hose and house pressure, maybe a scrub brush, a little elbow grease. Now, as we look at some of these old dairy barns and we look at them in cross section, this is probably what you're going to see. You're going to see center alleys, probably 7, 8 feet wide. We've got an existing gutter in there. It's probably 7 inches deep, 7 or 8 inches deep on this side and 10 to 12 over on the stall bed. So the stall bed sits a little higher than the center alley. That was so if the manure channel here, the gutter got too full, it would spill out into the center alley before it would back up onto the stall bed. There's usually a recess in here. They call it the toe hold. The old timers figured that helped the cow stand up, get a little bit of footing on her front end so she could hike her back end up. In here too, we've got a curb and then a stanchion is usually poured into the curb. Excuse me. And in front of the curb is the manger, and it's usually recessed. The idea was that as the cows ate, the new feed, the remaining feed, would find its way down here into a reach. You didn't have to do as much sweeping in, but we do have a feed alley. It's kind of elevated up here. You go along with the silage car to the wheelbarrow and feed them silage, feed them grain, do what you needed to do. So this is what you're usually looking at. Here's one option that we could do. We remove the curb, we remove the stanchion and the old manger. Come back in, fill it in with sand or compacted fill, and then pour a new slab over top of it, matching up with the saw cut here at the feed alley. You'll probably want to dowel this in to make sure it doesn't move and dowel it in down here too so it bites into the existing structure. Here we can continue to use the existing gutter and that works great, especially if this is a farrowing crate because the sow is going to have her head up here. She's not going to be able to turn around. And the way sows are plumbed, of course, everything comes out the back end. So it all ends up in the gutter. And if we can get that gutter working, that's all the better. And here's an example of how that might look. Now, this is a calf barn, yes. I mean, that's right. My principal responsibility is to the dairy industry, so I'm going to have a lot of calf photos. But imagine this as gestation crates or farrowing crate rather than a calf pen. What they did here, this was an old dairy barn. This was what we call a head-to-head dairy barn, where the animals were facing in. Their back end was facing out. There's a wall over on the outside wall on this other side. They broke out the curb, broke out the stanchions, stall dividers, and so on, poured a new floor with a little bit of slope tied into the existing floor. Now, when they go to clean these out, everything just flows downhill into the gutter. They can scrape it out nice and clean. a lot of effort. It's just the effort of getting stuff from one end to the other, ensuring it gets into the gutter. They go through, they dismantle these units, take them outside, pressure wash them outside, and they will hose down and broom down the concrete before bringing these back in after they've had a chance to dry. And in here too, we've got a ventilation system in. During the summer, we've got some large fans on the one end, and this is the leeward end of the building. So Mother Nature is pushing fresh air in behind us, and these fans are drawing it through the barn and exhausting it outside. And then they have a positive pressure tube in here again to get that 4 to 6 air changes per hour. And this runs 24/7, 365. And the nice thing about it is that it forces air down into the calf pen. So you could do the same thing, whether, like I said, it's a farrowing crate or gestation stall, it'll work. And this is an old barn. So with that, I will take any questions.
Feel free to put any questions in the chat and we will read them out for Tim. In the meantime, while you guys are putting your questions in there, I just wanted to let you all know that we'll be sending you an email with some upcoming opportunities for pig producers coming up here in February and March. So make sure to check your inboxes, most likely tomorrow for that.
Emma, do you want to share just a high-level overview of what
Sure.
those are looking like?
Yeah, sure. So in February, on the 13th and 14th, we have a Piglet Health 101 series, three in-person events. They're all the same. So you can pick the one that's closest to you. And we will cover all aspects of piglet health, but primarily focus in on that piglet processing. So castration, teeth clipping, tail clipping, vaccinations, all of that good stuff. And then in March, we'll have our producer summit and annual meeting. And this year, so that's March 13th and 14th in Hamilton, New York. And this year, the focus will be marketing. So there'll be some great opportunities, especially for direct-to-consumer marketers. But we will also have an opportunity for show pig producers as well. Obviously, anyone is welcome, but if you fall into those two categories, it will be especially useful for you this year. And both of those can be found on our website. And again, we'll send you the direct link to that so you can find it easily.
Thanks, Emma. And for those of you who are either adverse to typing, slow typers, want to talk, remember you can also raise your hand. We can unmute you and you can ask your question live. Okay.
So we do have a new question, Tim. Do you
Okay.
have any thoughts on management with pastured pork and overwintering in a barn like this? We currently just raised two litters and use part of a barn for them over winter, but thinking about expansion possibly.
Hmm. Okay, so we're pasturing these during the pasture season, but we're bringing them into the barn. Um, and that's very doable. I guess I'm not sure what exactly what the question, what you're looking for. Um, I don't know, Emma, do you?
Yeah. Amy, I don't know if you want to try to unmute Olivia and maybe she can ask
Yeah.
her question out loud.
Let me
Yeah, I
see if
mean,
I
the
can do
one
that.
thing I would say when, transferring pastured pigs into, barn facility, pastured pigs are very used to being able to root around, right? And be destructive, so to say. So you're definitely going to face challenges when bringing them into a barn setting unless you have, a concrete floor. The most foolproof way is a concrete floor with concrete walls that are just one piece, no seams. That's going to be your best bet. But especially those pastured pigs, they're definitely going to be looking for something to root around in. So especially important you think about flooring in that case. But okay, Olivia, I think you are unmuted, so feel free to add to your question.
Yeah, thank you. I mean that was helpful. Yeah, I don't have like I didn't have like a really like formed question because I'm just kind of exploring this. We were a dairy farm previously. My dad was a dairy farmer, and we have since transitioned to beef and and a small group of pigs and sheep. So beef is our primary enterprise, and we use our freestall barn right now to raise the beef, but it's almost more barn than they need. And as we get into a more beefier herd, we bred our dairy cows to beef, so we kind of made a beef herd out of dairy animals, and they kind of needed more of that barn protection than a regular beef herd. So essentially, I'm just kind of thinking about the way we use our barns in the future and kind of thinking about, oh, could that freestall barn that the beef are using now potentially be a source for raising pigs? But I'm just thinking about it, and I don't know if I want to like completely convert that out of the beef barn. So yeah, I don't really have a question. I'm trying to explore this and just kind of was curious if you'd had heard of anyone like doing something like that where they were both managing pigs on pasture, which we were doing seasonally, but we bring them in to a smaller barn space over the winter months, and then fair for them to farrow, and then we put everybody out on
Mhm.
pasture uh, come May.
Yeah, if there's anybody in the group here who has done that, say, yes, I have in the chat, then we can unmute you to maybe speak to this from your experience. Because I know that there's folks on this call who do this, and they do it successfully. Um, but if you don't want to share right now, that's okay. Carol, I'm
Carol,
gonna
do you
go
want
ahead and unmute you. Okay, you should have the opportunity to speak. You can go ahead and unmute yourself on the bottom left of your screen.
Okay,
There you go.
yes. We do about 100 cooney coons, or we have had 100, over 100 cooney coons, and out on pasture all spring, summer, fall. Fall is a really good time for, they love the weather in the fall because we're talking about 50 or 60 degrees, which is perfect for a pig, as Tim mentioned. And then as it gets colder, obviously you want to bring them inside, easier to care for them, easier to put your eyes on them, to see if there's somebody that's lagging behind or getting sick, and just easier to manage when they're inside. But my suggestion would be, if you're doing beef and pigs, is to not make it a permanent change, but make it kind of so you can go either way. So it's a little bit flexible, make your system flexible so you can either have, if your pig operation gets bigger, you can go that way, or if your beef operation gets bigger, you can expand that way. We have beef also, so we kind of do that. We also have sheep. So it kind of works really well if you just stay flexible and keep the systems kind of open. Like, you would not want to put permanent farrowing pens or gestation pens in everything. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
You kind of use gates that work for beef, gates that work for pigs, and gates that work for sheep. And you just keep it flexible that way. That's my suggestion.
Okay. And
Thanks,
I see.
Carol.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I can just add one thing to that. I see we brought Danielle in, but one thing I would say to Olivia, if you're bringing sows into farrow, that's a whole other set of parameters that you need to think about. Traditional hog panel can keep, sows and boars in. Um, Over time they'll bend it and push on it. But when we think about having litters, piglets can easily crawl out of those. We've had that happen on our own farm. So just something to think about if you're going to be having litters. You need to have a place for them to get away from mom. Just some additional considerations that you might not have to think about for, market hogs or breeding stock. Okay. We do have a couple more questions, but I see we have Danielle. So,
I just wanted to piggyback on kind of Olivia and Carol because my family has a dairy farm, and we do have a couple of different barns that are situated for transitional periods for our sows that farrow, and then sometimes they get cleaned out and calves go in there. So, kind of what Emma had just also said, you just have to make sure that things can be transitioned for each group and kind of what you need. You can't use the same gate for beef cattle that you might be able to for a sow that's just farrowed with a litter, because as Emma had said, those pigs have to, you know, they'll get through anything they can, but it is doable as long as you kind of have a plan and the mechanisms in place to transition things, especially if you maybe only have one barn at the moment. So I just wanted to piggyback that it is doable. We've done it here before. You just kind of have to be interchangeable and flexible with where things go and kind of your layout.
And you can be strategic, about where they might go in your barns. For example, on my own personal farm, it is an old tie stall dairy. But down below, there's full concrete heifer pens. So concrete walls, concrete floors. And, we knew immediately when we walked into the barn that that's where our sows and boars would be going, because they cannot destroy the concrete
Okay.
walls and floors. So be strategic about, where you're gonna put these animals. You can definitely do yourself a favor there. And the other thing to consider is that what might work for one group of hogs might not work for another. Just like any other animal, pigs are individuals, and sometimes one is more destructive than another. So it might work the first year you do it, and then the next year you have pigs getting out all the time, and they just happen to be a little bit annoying that year. So, just something to think about. It's kind of a ever-evolving situation, I would say. Okay, hopefully, Olivia, that we gave you some good tips and tricks there and a little overview of how it can look. Okay, Beth and I'm guessing Dawn, it's cut off there. Curious what breed of hogs you raise and how you house them year round. My adult hogs are on pasture year round and are only brought in for farrowing. So I think we kind of covered that. Obviously, depending on the breed of pigs you have, there might be different height requirements. Cooney coon is a little bit different than, a full size Duroc, for example. So, that is something you could consider, but typically hog panel will keep any of the above in. I don't know if Tim, there's anything else you want to add on this topic, but I think we,
I think, anytime you're talking hogs, it's like going through your house and childproofing for a 2-year-old.
yes.
But you're dealing with, instead of dealing with a 2-year-old, you're basically dealing with a tank. They are going to destroy whatever there is to destroy, and they will find it.
Yeah,
Mhm.
Not being
absolutely.
malicious, they're just being a pig.
For sure. Okay, so we do have another question from Carol. Um, do the fans, I'm guessing that are traditionally in dairy barns, have a thermostat on them? Seems like they would not need to run during a night like this, or would they be on a timer?
Probably those fans are on a thermostat. Um, Question is, does a thermostat still work? Uh, and a lot of times, those systems are so filled with cobwebs and condensation and all kinds of stuff that they don't work. But you could easily put them on a new thermostat and set those thermostats such that, yeah, on a night like tonight, they're not running. But you still want to have something coming in, and that's where those tubes are very helpful because, again, it's going to be pushing air down in front of the animal, but only at a rate at about 60 feet per minute. So it's about 1 foot per second, which is about our normal exhale. If you want to get an idea of what that is. Um, and what we consider that is still air, not stagnant air. We're still moving some fresh air in there to keep fresh air in front of those animals, um, but it's not totally dead. And that's what we don't want. We don't want to go so far that there's no air movement at all, because that can be um, very injurious to the animal in terms of respiratory health.
Carol commented that she does like the tubes.
The big thing about tubes is they have to be designed right and installed correctly. And that's when I usually get called is because somebody has tubes in and the system's not working. And when we run the specs on it, well, no wonder it's not working. The specs are off the charts. They're not operating where they're supposed to be. They're not something that you just go down to Tractor Supply and pull this fan and that tube and put the two together and you're good to go. It is an engineered system, and in order for it to work, it needs to be engineered.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, if anyone has any other questions, please do throw them in the chat now. As you're doing that, I can tell you a little bit about the video series. So it's a three-part series at the moment, featuring three different farms. So the first video that's already been released is a farm that's considering raising pigs. So, kind of what do you need to think about from the very beginning before you bring pigs into your barn? The second video is a farm that's kind of mid-transition. So they are raising pigs, but there's certainly many updates that they can make to their facility to, make all of the things that we've talked about a little bit better. It's working, but there could be improvements. And then the third video is a farm that, is kind of end stages of conversion. I'm sure they're making small tweaks, but they've done a ton of work to really make the facility work for them and work for pigs. And I really recommend that you go and watch that particular video because you can really gather a lot of ideas from that. And that video features Matt Harper from Bit of Breeze Farm, who does just really a phenomenal job. So, okay.
All right. I'm gonna go ahead, Emma, if there's nothing else in the chat, I'm gonna shut off the recording, so that folks can ask questions off the recording if they'd like to. So we're gonna be done with